You think your HOA is just about mowing the lawn and painting fences? Think again. In this episode of HOA Karen Files, we're diving into the world where rules aren't just rules, they're weapons. A man's dream home quickly turns into a battleground when an HOA president with a taste for control decides his property is fair game. But here's the kicker. The real power struggle isn't about lawns or mailboxes. It's about greed, manipulation, and a community fighting to take back what's theirs. Ever dealt with a neighbor from hell? Ever had an HOA push you too far? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your stories. Because trust me, this battle is far from over. I didn't fight my way through 3 decades of late rent, noisy neighbors, and landlords who treated leaky roofs like natural disasters to end up at war with a suburban tyrant. But life has a wicked sense of humor. It started with a modest dream, a yard, a garage, and a door I could paint any damn color I wanted. After years of watching the housing market rise and fall like a crooked poker game, I finally cashed in my chips. I closed on a quiet little 3-bedroom craftsman tucked just outside the grasping claws of the Pinehurst Estates Homeowners Association. That last part mattered. A lot. The previous owners were clear about it. We stood in the kitchen the day I signed the paperwork, and the wife handed me a folder with survey maps, boundary lines marked in bold red, and the words "not subject to show governance" circled twice in blue ink. It was practically a war banner. They weren't just selling me a house, they were handing me a legacy of defiance. Pinehurst Estates lay just across the street, a beautiful neighborhood on paper-manicured lawns, quiet streets, tasteful seasonal wreaths. But dig deeper and you'd find something uglier, a rulebook thick as a Bible, and an HOA president who wielded it like scripture. But me, I was free. For 2 months, I lived like a man released from a lifelong sentence. I planted tomatoes, real dirt-grown, heirloom tomatoes that I'd babied from seed. I painted my front door a shade of blue that would have triggered a citation across the street. I even put up a hummingbird feeder that dangled proudly in full view of the Pinehurst watchdogs. It was mine, all of it. And then came the neighborhood barbecue. It was marketed as a community mixer, a friendly affair bridging the HOA and the so-called boundary dwellers like me. Free burgers, local beers, polite small talk with tightly wound people in Vineyard Vines polos. What could go wrong? That's where I met her. Victoria Harrington. The name carried weight, even her martini glass seemed afraid to spill in her presence. She floated around in pressed linen, barking directions with a smile that never touched her eyes. President of the HOA for 12 years, local real estate agent, and apparent queen of the cul-de-sac. She cornered me near the potato salad. "You're the new homeowner on Oakwood Drive," she said, voice syrupy, sweet with a blade underneath. "We've noticed your landscaping quite expressive." I smiled politely and responded with the line I'd already practiced. "Actually, I'm outside the HOA boundaries. I'm not under your jurisdiction." She laughed. Not a real laugh, more like ice cracking on a frozen pond. "Oh, that old confusion," she said, waving a manicured hand. "We're in the process of correcting some long-standing boundary issues. Your property's always been meant to be part of Pinehurst. We'll have the updated documents soon." That was the first time I felt the shift, like the ground beneath my foundation had subtly tilted. I left the barbecue with a full stomach, a forced smile, and a creeping suspicion that Victoria Harrington wasn't just a control freak. She was planning something. At the time, I shrugged it off. Boundary disputes happen, sure. Bureaucracy moves slow, but my papers were solid. My lawyer had checked them twice. Still, I added a second camera over the garage just in case. What I didn't know then was that I'd soon need every piece of evidence I could get my hands on, because Victoria wasn't just planning a welcome committee. She was preparing an invasion. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of forgettable afternoon where nothing should go wrong. I was coming back from the grocery store, arms full of reusable bags, already mentally unloading the evening ahead, grill a steak, water the tomatoes, maybe catch the game. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something that stopped me cold. My garage door was open, not halfway, not jammed, fully open wide like an invitation. At first, I thought I'd forgotten to close it, but then I saw them. Two full-size Ford F-150s, polished to a showroom shine, parked side by side in my garage like they owned the place. Oversized tires, custom grills. One had a bumper sticker that read, HO Life in block letters. My own car, a dusty, loyal Honda Civic, sat exiled on the driveway like a mutt denied entry to a pedigree show. I froze, bags hanging from my arms, oranges rolling across the pavement. I scanned the street like I was expecting Ashton Kutcher to jump out and yell, "Punked." But there was no joke here. This was real. I yanked out my phone and pulled up the security camera app. The footage had already uploaded. Timestamp, 11:14 a.m. There she was, Victoria Harrington, standing in my driveway, tapping a remote device like she was opening her own garage. Behind her, a man in slacks waved her forward like he was directing planes on a runway. The F-150s rolled in smoothly, one after the other. Victoria never even knocked. She didn't hesitate. She didn't pause. She acted like she belonged. It was the smugness that got me the casual authority. The way she gestured with two fingers to position the trucks precisely. She might as well have been arranging topiaries. I dropped the groceries inside, locked the house, and marched straight to the Pinehurst Estates clubhouse. According to my neighbor Greg, Victoria held court there most afternoons, sipping sparkling water and issuing violation notices like royal decrees. The clubhouse was exactly what you'd expect: fake colonial trim, plastic hydrangeas, and a front desk with more marble than most courthouses. I walked in and spotted her immediately behind a desk that looked like it had been stolen from a minor CEO, flipping through a stack of papers with a frown-faced assistant beside her. I didn't bother with greetings. "What gives you the right," I said, voice low but clear, "to break into my garage and park someone else's trucks in it?" Victoria didn't flinch. She looked up as if I'd asked her why the sky was blue. Mildly annoyed, vaguely inconvenienced. "Mr. Morgan," she said with the tone of someone scolding a toddler. "We're hosting our annual garden showcase this weekend. The trucks belong to visiting guests from the regional HOA board." She said it like I was supposed to be honored. "Large utility vehicles can clutter the streets during high-profile events," she continued. "To maintain the appearance of our community, we temporarily relocate them to less featured properties. Less featured." My fists clenched. "I'm not part of your HOA," I reminded her, emphasizing each word. Victoria smiled that same Arctic smile from the barbecue. "That's an administrative oversight currently being corrected," she said, pulling out a manila folder. "We've begun integrating border lots like yours that were previously misclassified." She said it like it was a routine formality, like annexing someone's home was the same as adjusting a zip code. I demanded she remove the trucks, or at least give me the contact info of their owners. Instead, she handed me a business card, Pinehurst Parking Services, a name I'd never heard before and doubted even existed. "The vehicles are under secure HOA management," she said. "They'll be removed after the event concludes tomorrow evening." As she stood to show me the door, she patted my arm. "I also noticed your hedges have exceeded 36 inches, she said, eyes sharp. "Just a friendly reminder, that's the maximum under Section 4, Paragraph 12. She closed the door before I could say another word. I walked home that afternoon with a business card in my pocket, 2 unauthorized trucks in my garage, and the sinking realization that Victoria didn't recognize boundaries legal, personal, or otherwise. She wasn't just playing HOA president. She was waging a quiet war. I don't like confrontation. Never have. But there comes a time when you've had enough, and my limit was crossed the moment I saw those trucks parked in my garage. So, I did what anyone would do when someone takes over their space without permission. I went to the source. I didn't bother calling Victoria or sending her a passive-aggressive email. No, I stormed right to the clubhouse, the place where all the HOA magic happened, where she'd likely be holding court again, pulling the strings like a puppet master. The building was quieter today, the usual chatter replaced with the soft rustle of paper. Victoria was behind her desk, as expected, wearing that same prim expression that made her seem like she could deliver bad news without breaking a sweat. I didn't knock. I didn't ask for permission. I just walked in. Her eyes barely lifted from the papers in front of her as I spoke. I want the trucks out of my garage. Right now. She glanced up slowly, annoyance creeping into her smile. Mr. Morgan, we've already discussed this. It's simply a matter of community standards. I cut her off. You don't get to park other people's cars in my garage. You don't get to walk in here and tell me how to live. You've overstepped your bounds, and you know it. She leaned back in her chair, gliding her fingers across the surface of the desk, a practiced motion that made it seem like I was interrupting something far more important than my own home. Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice smooth. You're still not understanding the bigger picture here. I wanted to slam my fist down on her desk, but I held it together. I needed the upper hand. And Victoria was too good at playing mind games to let her win by baiting me into an emotional outburst. We're hosting a prestigious event this weekend. The trucks belong to important figures in the HOA network. They cannot be seen cluttering the streets of Pinterest, she continued, not a hint of apology in her voice. These dignitaries are accustomed to certain privileges. It was then that I realized what was happening. Victoria wasn't just trying to maintain some aesthetic standard. This wasn't about lawns or mailboxes. This was about power, money, control. Her smile never wavered. She was so sure of herself, so smug in her belief that she could do whatever she wanted because she had the authority of the HOA behind her. I shook my head. I'm not part of your HOA. I'm not your subject. Her eyes narrowed just the slightest bit. That's an administrative issue that we're currently correcting. We've already begun integrating properties like yours that were mistakenly left out of Pinterest. You'll receive the corrected paperwork soon. I held my ground. No, I want the trucks out. And I want you to understand that I'm not going to let this slide. I'll call the police if I have to. This is trespassing. Victoria's demeanor shifted, but only slightly. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. The picture of calm authority. Mr. Morgan, she said softly. I understand your frustration, but understand this. You're fighting something bigger than yourself. This is about the future of the community, the integrity of Pinterest. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. Her voice had a velvet edge to it, but it felt more like a threat than a reassurance. These trucks will remain in your garage until the event is over, she said, standing up. And I suggest you consider the long-term benefits of cooperation. After all, your property values will benefit from our community standards. I couldn't believe it. She was acting like she was doing me a favor. It was like she thought I'd bow down and thank her for the privilege of having 2 luxury trucks sitting in my garage, taking up the space that was supposed to be mine. I looked her in the eye. I'll be in touch with the authorities. Victoria. And don't think for a second that I won't fight this. She smiled again. That same cold, calculating smile. Of course, Mr. Morgan. You do what you must. But remember, we're doing this for the greater good of the community. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. But before I could make it to my car, I heard the unmistakable sound of a cell phone ringing. Victoria was already calling someone, probably Officer Martinez. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I tried everything I could think of to handle this the right way. First, I called the police. I figured if I could prove that Victoria was trespassing on my property, I'd at least have some legal recourse. This was no longer about some trucks taking up space in my garage. It was about principle. She had no right to invade my space, no right to impose her will. Officer Martinez arrived about 30 minutes later, his face pinched with the kind of exasperation you only get from dealing with people who think HOA disputes are on the same level as robberies. He listened patiently, but I could tell he'd heard this story 1,000 times before. Another Pinterest dispute. Huh, he sighed, flipping open his notebook. You know, I've been called out here for this kind of thing more than I care to remember. I showed him the security footage from my cameras. Victoria standing in my driveway, clicking open my garage door like she was a guest in a hotel. Not a trespasser. Martinez watched the footage, his frown deepening as the trucks rolled into my garage. You got a good case here, Mr. Morgan, he said after a moment. but you're in a gray area. She's claiming authorized access as part of some HOA event, right? If that's the case, it becomes a civil matter. Unless we can prove criminal intent, there's not much I can do. I felt the heat rise in my chest. This was a joke. Victoria had taken over my property and was trying to push me around, and all the law could do was shrug its shoulders and tell me to fight it in court. Martinez must have seen the frustration on my face. He shook his head. Look, document everything, get a lawyer, and go down to the city planning office to get the property boundaries officially sorted out. That's your best bet. Great, I muttered. Just what I wanted, more red tape. Martinez's sympathy didn't help much, but he didn't have answers. I was on my own. So I did what any reasonable person would do when they are told no one can help. I called a tow truck. I contacted 3 different companies, hoping one of them would tow the F-150s out of my garage. The first company hung up on me. The second one said they couldn't help because the vehicles were technically on private property. And the third, well, they made the situation even more ridiculous. Sir, I need to ask, the operator said, clearly reading from a script. Have you taken your medication today? What the hell, I was being treated like a lunatic for wanting the vehicles out of my garage. After a few more failed attempts, I realized something. Victoria had already made calls. She had her fingers in everyone's pockets, and her influence was reaching further than I ever expected. She'd been laying the groundwork for this for years, and I was nothing more than an obstacle in her path. There was no easy way out of this, but I wasn't going to roll over. I started digging. I wasn't going to wait for the police or some high-priced lawyer to do it for me. I had a plan now. My first lead came from Greg, my neighbor, who'd been more than willing to chat when I finally caught him on a quiet afternoon. He had a nervous look in his eyes as he invited me in. It was clear he didn't want to get involved, but he also couldn't help himself. "You've poked the bear, man," he said, handing me a beer and lowering his voice like he was telling me the secret of the universe. "Victoria's been playing this boundary game for years. You're not the first one. Your property and about 7 others along the border have been in this weird limbo. Technically, you're not in Pinterest, but she's been pushing to annex these places since she took over." I leaned in, trying to make sense of it all. Greg's voice was quieter now, as if even speaking the truth could get him in trouble. "The people who lived here before you, they sold because of her. They got violation notices for nothing. Fake bills, threats of liens. It was like she was playing some kind of psychological warfare." My heart sank. I wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president. I was dealing with a woman who had broken people before me. "But why hasn't anyone done anything about it?" I asked. "Frustrated?" Greg chuckled. But it wasn't a laugh of amusement. "Richard, her husband, corporate attorney. He's got connections everywhere. Plus, half the neighborhood is afraid of her. The rest, they're too busy benefiting from her schemes." That was the key. Victoria wasn't just a petty tyrant. She had built herself a network, a web of influence that kept everyone in line. And the people who didn't go along with it, they were crushed, slowly but surely. I wasn't going to be one of those people. I wasn't going to just sit back and let her win. That afternoon, I found a violation notice on my door. It wasn't for parking or trash or anything that made sense. No. This time it was for something as ridiculous as the font and size of my house numbers. Pinterest Estates had a rule about approved house number formats, and my numbers didn't meet their standards. I stared at the notice, blinking in disbelief. This was the kind of petty nonsense I was up against. It was clear now that Victoria wasn't just trying to control my property, she was trying to break me. Every fine, every notice, every subtle threat was designed to wear me down, to get me to give in. But I wasn't backing down. I wasn't going to let her win. I started doing the one thing she never counted on. I started fighting back. I'd had enough of playing by the rules, at least the rules Victoria had written. I wasn't going to stand idly by while she steamrolled over everything I'd worked for. My house, my garden, my freedom, they weren't hers to control. So, I decided to dig deeper and hit her where it hurt. I'd learned enough from Greg's reluctant confession to know that I wasn't the only one on the receiving end of her manipulations. I wasn't the first target in this little war, and I sure as hell wasn't going to be the last unless someone stepped up and fought back. So, I started making calls. I didn't just want to remove the trucks from my garage anymore. I wanted to bring the whole damn system down. I called the local concierge at the only luxury hotel in town, asking about the truck owners. They were staying at the hotel for the garden tour. She confirmed. The trucks were part of the HOA's VIP parking program, and they weren't supposed to be parked in my garage. It was all part of the farce. Next, I tracked down the owners of the Ford F-150s. They weren't the aloof rich guys I'd imagined. No, they were just normal folks who'd paid the HOA's $75 premium parking fee to store their trucks in a secure, HOA-managed facility while they attended the event. They had no idea they'd been misled, or that their vehicles had been stored in my private garage without my consent. When I spoke to Mr. Peterson, the owner of one of the trucks, he was more than apologetic. We paid for that service directly through the HOA. Victoria personally assured us our trucks would be safely stored, he said, his voice tinged with confusion. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Victoria had sold them on the idea that my home was part of the HOA's jurisdiction. But that wasn't true. She had just lied to them and to me to get what she wanted. I informed Mr. Peterson that he could pick up his truck immediately, and he promised to do so. By noon, my garage was mercifully empty again, but the relief was short-lived. When I returned home that afternoon, I found something else waiting for me, a Pinehurst Estates welcome packet stuffed into my mailbox. This wasn't a polite welcome to the neighborhood card. Oh no. It was a 120-page rulebook, complete with community guidelines, compliance inspection schedules, and a dues statement demanding $300 for the first month. The map inside was the kicker. It clearly marked my property as part of the HOA boundaries. I stared at the map, stunned. This wasn't just an administrative error. Victoria had planted this lie long before I ever moved in. Something wasn't adding up. The maps I had received when I bought the house showed I was not in Pinehurst Estates. The paperwork was clear, and my lawyer had confirmed it. But now I was holding a map that suggested my home had always been part of her little kingdom. It was time to get some answers. I drove straight to the city planning office, determined to get to the bottom of this. After hours of sitting in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room, the clerk finally handed me a copy of the official property records for my lot. As I scanned the documents, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The city's official records clearly showed my property outside the HOA boundaries. It was as if the HOA's map was a complete fabrication. I had a legal weapon, now the truth. I called Greg again. This time, his voice had a new edge to it, a little more urgency. "I've been telling you," he said. "Victoria's been pulling this trick for years. She's slowly been trying to bring in the border properties, getting them to pay dues, sending them violation notices. You're not the first one to get these bogus maps. It was all falling into place. Victoria's grand plan wasn't just about parking trucks in people's garages. It wasn't about a fancy garden tour or maintaining property values. It was about money. She was using the HOA to extend her control over properties that had no legal obligation to join. And once she had you paying dues, she would find ways to make you stay either by harassing you with fines or pressuring you with false claims of violations. I couldn't just sit on this information. I needed to take action fast. I called an attorney, someone who specialized in property law. The lawyer's name was Jessica Taylor, and when I explained the situation, she didn't waste any time. She'd heard of Victoria's antics before. "I've seen this type of thing," she said. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last if we don't do something about it." Jessica became my ally, and we started building a case. We gathered every document we could find, every notice from the HOA, every questionable charge. My security footage from the garage was a key piece of evidence. Together, we started putting together a portfolio, the Victoria files, that would tear her reign apart. I wasn't just documenting the trucks anymore. I was documenting her entire operation. But I knew it wasn't enough to just gather evidence. I needed more. I needed to expose her to the neighborhood, to the world. That's when I decided to take the fight public. It was becoming clear that if I wanted to win this battle, I couldn't do it alone. Victoria had built her empire on manipulation, intimidation, and money. She was smart enough to recruit enablers within the community, and it was time for me to find the people who were tired of her grip on Pinterest estates. I didn't know where to start. For months, I'd lived as a boundary dweller, separate from the HOA and their little world of rules and regulations. I knew the neighbors around me, but none of them had shown much interest in fighting back. Most of them seemed content or afraid to let Victoria control the neighborhood. But Greg had given me hope. He had already told me that I wasn't the first person to be sucked into Victoria's games. That meant there had to be others, people who had been worn down, people who had seen the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. I started knocking on doors. I began with the neighbors closest to me, people who lived in the houses along the border between the HOA and what I now considered my home. One by one, I introduced myself, explained my situation, and asked if they had ever felt like the HOA was overstepping its bounds. At first, it was a slow trickle. Many of them were reluctant to speak up. Victoria had her ways of making people feel like they were on the wrong side of the fence. "She's the HOA president," one neighbor told me, her voice low. "She has the power to make our lives miserable." But as I spoke to more and more people, the walls began to come down. The complaints came pouring in. "Violation notices for no reason," said one neighbor, who had been told her hedges were too tall, even though they met the HOA's requirements. "Threats of liens against our property if we didn't comply with the landscaping rules." It was constant. Another neighbor told me that she'd received a fine for a broken mailbox, a minor issue, but one that Victoria had turned into a threat of legal action. She'd been forced to pay or risk her property being seized. She was done with it. And then there was Richard, the retired school teacher, who told me how Victoria had tried to pressure him into paying for landscaping services that he never asked for. "She sent someone to fix my lawn without asking," he said, shaking his head. "Then she sent me a bill. When I refused to pay, she threatened to report me to the board. I've never paid a cent." The more I heard, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my property anymore. Victoria's reign had affected everyone in Pinterest Estates, and there were more people than I thought who were ready to fight back. I made a decision. It was time to organize. I started reaching out to people, setting up meetings at my house. At first, only a few showed up, the quiet, reluctant ones who'd been living under the radar, afraid to speak out. But slowly, word spread. People began to realize that they weren't alone. I set up a secure online group for residents to share their experiences and evidence. We called it Pinterest Watch, and within a week, the stories flooded in. Others shared their own evidence of Victoria's abuse of power. Email chains, violation notices, bills for services never requested. It was becoming clearer by the day that Victoria had been using the HOA as her personal tool of manipulation for years. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table with Jessica, we went over the materials we'd gathered. We had a mountain of evidence now, enough to take Victoria down. But we needed more. We needed to find a way to bring this to the attention of the entire neighborhood, to show them that they'd been living under a lie for too long. "I think it's time," Jessica said, looking at the pile of documents in front of us. "We need to make a public statement. We need to confront Victoria, not just in private, but in front of everyone." I agreed. If we were going to win this, we needed the support of the community. And to get that, we needed to show them the truth. Victoria thought she could control everything, but she didn't anticipate how far I was willing to go. The tipping point came one afternoon when I was reviewing my evidence in the comfort of my living room, finally piecing together the case against her. That's when I saw it, a new violation notice pinned to my door. This one wasn't like the others. It wasn't about house numbers or landscaping. This was personal. It read, "Failure to comply with Pinterest Estates community guidelines regarding unauthorized signage." I stared at the notice, at the bold letters scrawled across it like some sort of decree. The violation. The signs I'd posted at the edge of my property, the ones that read, "This property is not subject to Pinterest HOA guidelines." Apparently, even my right to express my autonomy was a violation now. I ripped the notice off the door, my blood pressure rising as the realization hit. Victoria wasn't just trying to control my property. She was waging psychological warfare, throwing obstacles at me to break my resolve. She knew I was making progress, that people were starting to listen, and this was her way of fighting back. I had been prepared for some retaliation, but this was different. The small annoyances were one thing, but this was an outright power play. Victoria wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was trying to silence me. That evening, I called a meeting with the group I'd started, Pinterest Watch. They'd become a lifeline, a support system, and most importantly, a collection of voices that Victoria could no longer ignore. I gathered everyone in my living room. Greg showed up, along with a few more neighbors, some eager, others still reluctant but desperate for change. "I've had enough," I said, standing in front of them. "We can't keep letting her do this. We have the evidence. We have the support. It's time to make our move." Greg raised an eyebrow. "What's the plan?" "We go public," I said, holding up a printed copy of the violation notice. "Victoria's not going to stop. She's going to keep pushing us until we give in. But we have the truth on our side. It's time to show the rest of Pinterest what's been happening behind closed doors." The room grew quiet as everyone considered the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a few trucks or a few fines anymore. This was about exposing a corrupt system and taking down the woman who had built it. It was about showing everyone that standing up for your rights didn't just mean fighting for your property. It meant fighting for the integrity of your community. I set up a plan. We would document everything: the emails, the fines, the evidence of Victoria's abuse of power, the evidence of her financial manipulation. We would compile it all into a comprehensive report and post it online for everyone to see. I would circulate it to the local news outlets, making sure that no one in the neighborhood could ignore what was going on. We would shine a light on the corruption and force her to face it head on. The first step was gathering more support. The people I'd spoken to so far were just the beginning. There were more residents out there who had been victims of Victoria's regime, but they were afraid to speak out. They feared the consequences of crossing her, but they were tired of living in fear. Now, they needed to know they weren't alone. One by one, I approached neighbors I had never spoken to before, telling them my story, asking them to stand with us. Slowly, the tide began to shift. Some were hesitant, but others jumped in with both feet. They had seen the cracks in Victoria's armor, and now they were ready to help take her down. The more people I spoke to, the more I realized just how deeply entrenched she was in the community. But the more they spoke up, the more emboldened I became. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was the fight of every person who had ever been bullied or harassed by her. The night I finished the report was the same night everything came to a head. I received an alert on my security camera. Pamela, Victoria's assistant, was at my front door again, taking pictures of my house numbers. She'd been here before, but this time, I didn't care. I was ready to confront her. I marched out to the front porch, my heart pounding in my chest. Pamela froze when she saw me standing there. Taking more pictures for Victoria, I asked, crossing my arms. Her face flushed with frustration, but she didn't say anything. She just kept her camera aimed at my house like she had every right to be there. "You've been spying on me for weeks," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You've been taking photos of my property, sending violation notices, and you're just going to keep pushing, aren't you?" Pamela said nothing. She simply turned, snapped one more picture, and began to walk away. "That's not going to work anymore." I called after her. "We're going to take this to the people. It's over." The next day, I sent out the report. It was a call to arms, a call to action, and the community responded. When I sent the report out, I knew I was igniting a fire that couldn't be extinguished. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the entire community waking up to the truth. Only a few days after the report was sent out, I received a message from Jessica, the lawyer who had been helping me investigate Victoria. She had dug deeper and uncovered something suspicious. Victoria had ties to a private company called Community Management Services, a company I had never heard of before. When Jessica sent me the documents relating to HOA financial transactions, I started to see the bigger picture. There were invoices for bogus services, unexplained fees, and a shell company that had been receiving money from the HOA. The company was run by none other than Victoria's husband, Richard. The money that should have been spent for the benefit of the residents was being funneled into their pockets. I felt like I was holding the smoking gun in my hands. This was the moment I'd been waiting for evidence. As soon as I had this information, I shared it with my neighbors, with the Pinterest watch group. More and more people started coming forward, sharing their own stories of Victoria's manipulation, emails, violation notices, invoices for services that were never requested. People were starting to see the truth. I wasn't alone anymore. There were more of us than I thought, and together, we had a mountain of evidence. One evening, as I sat with Jessica, we reviewed the pile of documents. We were building a case, and we were getting closer to the moment when we could finally expose Victoria. But there was one more thing we needed to do. We had to go public. We can't just keep this between us anymore, Jessica said, her voice firm. We need to confront her, and we need to do it in front of the entire neighborhood. Let's make this public. Let everyone see what she's been doing. I agreed. If we were going to win this, we needed the community behind us. We needed to show them the truth. The next day, I received a notification that Pamela, Victoria's assistant, was at my door again. This time, she wasn't just taking pictures of my house numbers. She was walking around my property, as if she had the right to be there. I couldn't let this go on anymore. I walked out onto the porch to confront her. She froze when she saw me standing there. Taking more pictures for Victoria, I asked, my voice steady. She didn't respond. She just raised her camera and snapped another shot, ignoring me as if I wasn't standing right in front of her. You've been spying on me for weeks, I said. Taking photos, sending violation notices, and you're just going to keep doing it, aren't you? Pamela didn't say a word. She simply turned away, took one last picture, and started to walk off. I didn't stop her. She was just a pawn in Victoria's game. But I needed her to know that it was over. That's not going to work anymore. I called after her. We're going to take this to the people. It's over. The next day, I sent out the report. I made sure to send it to every neighbor I could reach, along with local news outlets. It was a call to action, a call to expose Victoria for who she truly was. And the neighborhood responded. The response was overwhelming. People who had once been afraid to speak out now felt empowered. They began sharing their own stories of Victoria's manipulation and intimidation. What I had suspected all along was true. She had been using the HOA to control and exploit the people of Pinterest estates. But it wasn't just about the violations, the fines, or the trucks in my garage. It was about the system she had built around her, a system that she thought no one could touch. That system was crumbling now, piece by piece, and there was no turning back. The next HOA meeting came, and I knew Victoria would try to control the narrative once again. But this time, we had something she couldn't ignore. We had the truth. The HOA meeting was set. Victoria had called it. No surprise there. She knew the storm was coming. I could see it in her eyes as I walked into the clubhouse. She was already holding court, her usual poised self, sitting at the head of the table, ready to take charge. But today was different. Today. I wasn't just a resident in her territory. Today. I was the one in control. The room was filled, and there were more eyes on me than I'd ever seen before. Normally, these meetings were nothing more than formalities, small talk, updates on trivial matters, the occasional complaint about a neighbor's lawn. But today, there was an electricity in the air. The atmosphere felt charged, like a volcano ready to erupt. As soon as I walked in, heads turned, some with wary glances, some with curiosity, but I noticed a few faces that weren't just watching. They were waiting for the moment when the truth would be revealed. Victoria's smile faltered as I took my seat. She knew exactly what was coming, but she didn't dare show it. The meeting started as usual, a few pleasantries, some introductions, a quick rundown of old business. Then, as expected, the floor was opened for new business. I stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steady. I've been a resident of this neighborhood for a short time, but what I've witnessed in that time is something I can no longer ignore. I've spent weeks gathering evidence, speaking with my neighbors, and listening to the stories of those who've been intimidated, manipulated, and threatened. I paused, watching as a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Victoria's fingers were drumming on the edge of the table. She knew I had something, but she had no idea how much. I have in my hands I continued, pulling out the folder filled with documents. Proof that Victoria Harrington has been abusing her position as the president of this HOA to not only manipulate the residents of Pinehurst Estates, but also to line her own pockets with money that should have been used to benefit this community. The room fell silent. I could feel the eyes of everyone on me. The usual calm and orderly atmosphere of the meetings had vanished. I was no longer the lone voice. This was a battle for the truth. "I've gathered emails," I said, placing the stack of documents on the table in front of me. Emails where Victoria has discussed her plans to expand the HOA's boundaries beyond the legally defined limits. I have invoices for non-existent services and evidence of money being funneled into a shell company run by her husband, Richard Harrington. This money was not used for the benefit of the homeowners. It was stolen. I heard gasps from the crowd. Some residents exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked at Victoria, whose smile had completely vanished. "This is not just about a few trucks parked in my garage," I went on. "This is about a system of control, intimidation, and fraud that has affected each and every one of us here. It's about how Victoria and her husband have used their position to bully residents into paying for services they never asked for, to fine us for trivial violations, and to make sure they never lose their grip on power." I turned to Victoria, who was now sitting back in her chair, her face pale. "You've used this HOA to play games with people's lives. You've made us feel small and helpless. But the truth is, we have the power. And today, we take it back." Victoria's lips were pressed together, and for the first time, I saw her mask crack. She was cornered, and she knew it. "I demand," I said, looking directly at the board members who were seated around the table, "that Victoria Harrington be removed from her position as president of this HOA. She has abused her power and lied to us all. This is no longer about compliance. This is about holding her accountable for her actions." The room was silent for a moment, the tension palpable. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room, and for the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't alone. Greg stood up next to me, his voice shaking but strong. "I'm with Ethan. I've been living here for years, and I've seen the lies, the threats, the harassment. Enough is enough. We need to stop this before anyone else gets hurt." One by one, the other residents stood up. Some were hesitant, but many were ready to take back their neighborhood, their homes, their lives. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "This is ridiculous," she spat, trying to regain control. "You're all acting on misinformation. You've been misled, and I will not stand for this slander. You're the one who's been misleading us." "Victoria," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You've built this empire of lies, but today it all comes crashing down, and the rest of us will make sure of it." Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was defeated, and everyone in that room knew it. The vote was called. The board members had no choice but to acknowledge the evidence that had been presented. One by one, they voted. And when the last vote was counted, the result was clear. Victoria Harrington was no longer president of the Pinehurst Estates HOA. But that wasn't enough. We weren't just taking her down. We were going to rebuild the community with transparency, honesty, and respect for each other. The moment the vote was finalized, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. Victoria Harrington, once the iron-fisted ruler of Pinehurst Estates, was no longer in control. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone in the community who had suffered under her reign. As the meeting wound down, the mood in the room shifted from one of tension to something else: relief. People began talking to each other, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, and for the first time in a long while, there was hope in the air. Greg was the first to come over to me, clapping me on the back. "You did it, man. We did it." I looked around at the faces in the room. People I had barely spoken to before were now offering their congratulations, their support, and their thanks. It wasn't just about my personal struggle anymore. This was about the future of the whole community. It was a little surreal, honestly. I had spent months fighting Victoria, knowing that the fight was bigger than just my garage or my tomatoes. But now, as people congratulated me, it started to sink in. We'd just taken back our neighborhood. The next few days were a blur. Victoria and Richard, humiliated and facing mounting legal challenges, quickly packed up their things and left the house they had used to control the neighborhood. There were rumors about their sudden move whispers that they were heading for a new city, likely to escape the fallout of their fraud. The independent audit that had been promised came through, and it uncovered even more financial irregularities. The HOA's funds had been mismanaged, funneled into personal accounts, and Victoria's shell company had received over $80,000 in unauthorized payments. The HOA was forced to issue restitution to homeowners who had paid inflated fees. For me, it wasn't just about the money. It was about making sure that no one could ever get away with something like this again. I spent the next few weeks working with Jessica, helping to spread the word and ensure that people who had been victimized by Victoria knew they weren't alone. We connected with the media, shared the story, and soon enough, the entire town knew about the corruption in Pinehurst Estates. But it wasn't just the exposure that mattered. It was the change that came next. The HOA, now under the leadership of Greg, who had stepped in to replace Victoria, began a full overhaul. There would be no more secretive meetings or shady dealings. Every financial transaction was scrutinized, and transparency became the new rule of the land. The new board held an open meeting to vote on term limits for the president and other board members. No longer would a single person hold power indefinitely. No longer would anyone have the chance to manipulate the community for their own gain. But the biggest change came when the new board voted to reset the boundaries of the HOA, officially recognizing the properties that were outside Pinehurst Estate's jurisdiction. It was a symbolic gesture, but it meant a lot. It showed that, moving forward, everyone in the neighborhood would be treated fairly, regardless of whether they were part of the HOA or not. We held a community-wide celebration a few weeks after the vote, an outdoor barbecue at the park. It felt like the entire neighborhood showed up, from the longtime residents to the newer faces like mine. There were kids running around, adults chatting and laughing, and even the people who had once been silent in their fear of Victoria were now speaking up, sharing their stories. I couldn't help but smile as I looked around. It was exactly what I had imagined when I bought this house, a place where people could live freely, without fear of being controlled by an invisible hand, a place where community came first, not compliance to some outdated set of rules. And my garden, it had never looked better. But the real victory wasn't in the removal of Victoria or the restitution we received. It was in what came next. People started planting gardens. They painted their doors bold colors, let their lawns grow wild, and put up personalized mailboxes. The rigid rules of the past were gone, and in their place, creativity and individuality thrived. One of the best parts, my heirloom tomatoes. I'd finally grown the perfect batch, and at the barbecue, I shared them with everyone. No one cared about HOA-approved vegetable gardens. All they cared about was sharing the fruits of their labor with their neighbors. That evening, after the event wound down and people started packing up, Greg came over to me, holding a plate of food and a beer. "You know," he said, sitting next to me on the porch steps, "you might not have known it when you moved in, but you were exactly what this place needed." I chuckled. I'm not sure I was that great, but I'll take the compliment. He smiled. "No, really. You made us see that we could have something different, something better. And now, we have it." I looked out across the yard. The neighborhood felt different now. It felt like home. As the sun set behind the horizon, I thought about all the ways my life had changed since I first moved in. At the time, I had thought I was just buying a house. But now, I realized that I had bought a community, a real community, where people cared about one another, where we didn't have to live in fear of a tyrant in a cardigan. For the first time since moving here, I felt a sense of peace. I had my dream home, and now we had our dream neighborhood. So, what's the real takeaway here? Don't let anyone, no matter how powerful they think they are, dictate how you live. Stand up, speak out, and remember, you're never alone in this fight. If there's one thing we've learned today, it's that power corrupts, but truth always finds a way. Whether it's an HOA or the neighbor next door, standing up for what's right is the only way to reclaim your peace. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And as always, drop your own stories and thoughts in the comments. I love hearing from you. Thanks for watching, HOA Karen Files. Until next time, stay strong and keep fighting the good fight.